All right, people, here we go. Here is our lecture for today, Thursday, February 24th, 2022, in the year of our Lord. All right, let me make this nice and big so we can all see it. And here we go. All right, so you see three things up there on the screen. Manifest destiny. We'll hold off on that. We'll talk about that later. Um, the Texas Revolution will be our topic today, and the gold rush, the California gold rush, I should actually say. We will also talk about that later. We'll put that off till we're back in school together. But today we're going to focus on this, the Texas Revolution. What is the Texas Revolution? Okay, let's start at the beginning with Mexican independence. 1821, Spain lost control of their territory in America, and Mexico becomes an independent nation. Let me pause there for a second and say this. Okay, the people in Mexico, they revolted against Spain. Remember Spain, we've talked about it with a lot of our westward expansion. You've seen it on maps, Oregon Trail, Lewis and Clark, how most of California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas were all under control of Spain. Well, the people who were already there, the natives to that land in Mexico, they got angry, they revolted, fought a 10-year, 11-year war, and they won, and they kicked Spain out. So now all of that territory that used to be Spain is now what we know as Mexico, right? So that area that is Texas now, that was part of Mexico, the Mexican government opens up Texas to American settlement, giving land to those who move in. The big word there is giving. Remember, why do people leave where they're from? To go somewhere else. Free land is a big incentive, right? Especially back then or at any time. They gave me free land, I might move. I don't know. So by 1830, there were more than 30,000 Americans living in Texas. Remember, Texas part of Mexico at the time. 30,000 Americans living in Texas. There were less than 10,000 Mexican citizens living there in Texas, which was part of Mexico. So it was more American than Mexican, just that part of the Mexican territory, again, what is now Texas. So the Texans started to get unhappy because remember, this is still Mexican territory. Why were they upset? After 1830, the Mexican government began to pass laws that the Americans did not like. So remember 1830, this is pre-Indian removal. This is when Andrew Jackson is president of the United States. So does this sound familiar, some of this stuff? Yeah. Passing laws the Americans did not like. You know, it was Mexican territory just back in the 1770s, British territory, unfair laws, right? History repeats itself over and over. The Mexicans, the Mexican government banned slavery. No slavery in Mexico. This is South. Americans who moved there wanted to bring slaves. Mexico said, no go, no slavery in our land, right? So they told American settlers they had to become Mexican citizens. So you have to give up your American citizenship, basically, and become a citizen of Mexico, pay taxes to Mexico without representation. Again, does that sound familiar? Yes, taxation without representation. Americans get real angry about that stuff, right? So same thing here. And they had to convert to Roman Catholicism. Another thing Americans get angry about, if they told you now you have to change religions, everybody would get pretty teed off, right? So lots of reasons for Americans to get angry. We don't like being told what to do. And in this case, we have to give up our citizenship, pay unfair taxes to the Mexican government, and convert to Catholicism, which back then was an unpopular thing in America. Americans in Texas began to think, hey, we should make decisions for ourselves, just like during the American Revolution. We don't need the British, we don't need Mexicans, the Mexican government telling us what to do, British government, same thing. So this is key. Americans in Texas began to think they should make decisions for themselves. Okay, so this means war, right? That's why fighting begins. Okay, March 2nd, 1836, Texas declares its independence from Mexico. So we are no longer part of Mexico. Again, does that sound familiar? Declaration of Independence declares independence. It's the American way, right? At that time, declaring independence from someone who you feel is oppressing you. So Santa Anna, he was a dictator in Mexico. He was the ruler of Mexico, and he gathered Mexican troops to stop Texas's rebellion. So he says, "Wait a minute, this guy, his name is Santa Anna." He said, I am in charge here. Tell those Americans they cannot rebel and start their own territory or country. We have to stop them." So they sent troops. In San Antonio, a small Texas army had been defending a fort called the Alamo against a much larger Mexican army. So a lot of Mexican forces at the Alamo. Many of you have been down there. And if you wonder what that's all about, that's what it was. It was a fort that the Texans were using, Texans being Americans, and a big Mexican army surrounded the Alamo. The Americans held off the Mexican army for like 2 weeks, but ultimately all of the defenders of the Alamo died. So there were about 300 to 500 men, I think, there, but thousands of 300 to 500 Americans, thousands of Mexicans, and the Mexican army was able to kill every one of the Americans, and that really angered Americans because it was like a slaughter, and it was an unfair fight, and they didn't capture them; they killed them. So Americans were very upset over the battle at the Alamo. That's why it kind of still stands there today as a landmark in memory of that happening. All right, so how does the fighting end? How does this thing turn out? It ends at the Battle of San Jacinto. Santa Anna, the Mexican dictator, turned his attention to Sam Houston's army located near Galveston. So Sam Houston is an American general, right? A leader of the Americans, the American army there. Galveston, you've probably been there too. It's a beach town. Santa Anna was overly cocky and set up a camp in the wrong spot. So he was trying to set up a spot where they could fight the Americans, but they set up in a bad positioning, a tactical error, a military planning error. And on April 21st, 1836, while the Mexican army was resting, Houston's army attacked, shouting, "Remember the Alamo. So you slaughtered us, now we're going to slaughter you." So that's a famous line. You probably heard it before. Remember the Alamo. Remember attacking while resting, going back to the American Revolution, George Washington, Christmas Day, across the Delaware. Similar idea. Again, like I always say, history repeats itself generally. So remember the Alamo. Remember you slaughtered us. Now it's your turn. Here's some revenge right back at you. Santa Anna's army was destroyed, and he was forced to sign a treaty granting Texas independence from Mexico. So Texas was independent from Mexico and not part of the United States either. So Texas was essentially its own country for a little while. The Republic of Texas, not part of Mexico, not part of the United States. So what happens next? Let's wrap this up. Sam Houston was elected president of Texas. So former general becomes president of Texas. Texas is its own country, has its own president. Another way things work in America a lot of times. Back then, military hero George Washington, Andrew Jackson, becomes president. We used to elect military heroes as president back in the day, a couple hundred years ago. So Texas again offered land to other Americans from southern states to increase population. But here's the change. They can now bring slaves with them. So as a republic, as its own country, Texas allowed slavery. So why would they want other Americans to come here, come to Texas? Remember, again, going back to the Northwest Territory and the Northwest Ordinance, if you had a certain population, you could apply to statehood with the United States. So they want to become a state and not be their own country. Texas eventually wanted to become a part of the United States, but President Andrew Jackson did not want that in case of a war with Mexico, and maybe more importantly, he did not want there to be an additional slave state. So remember, balance, like we talked about, Missouri Compromise. Below that line just north of Oklahoma, Remember the 3630 line in the Missouri Compromise. If you bring in a state and it's below that line, which Texas was, so was what is now Oklahoma, but Texas was, then it would have to be a slave state. So Andrew Jackson pumped the brakes on allowing Texas to become part of the United States. Didn't want to throw off the balance in the Senate in the United States. So that is pretty much it. So for about 5 years, Texas ran as its own country, had its own president, its own government, and eventually, of course, as you see now, became part of the United States.